Next in our series of speakers on sustainable solutions. My name is Martha Works from the Geography Department, and before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to make a shameless plug for a program that I offer in September. It's a 2-week study abroad program to Tuscany, and it's 6 credits offered at the 400, 500 level. There are some flyers in the back room, and I'd love to tell you more about it. So see me if you'd like some more information about this 6-credit program, 2 weeks in Tuscany. And the title of the program is Tuscany Sustainability in City and Country. So let me know if you'd like some more information. Today, I am really happy to take a more international spin with our speaker, and I'm also delighted that she's a geographer. She has a PhD from University of Colorado and has worked in Ecuador for Ecociencia, which is an ecological foundation in Ecuador, and she's also worked for the Nature Conservancy in California. She currently is assistant professor of geography at San Diego State University and does research on land use. Well, let me actually read this so I don't get it mixed up. She does research on socioeconomic, policy, and ecological components of environmental change, and also on the effects of land use change on ecosystem services. She's going to be talking to us today about land use and land management and the production of ecosystem services in the Ecuadorian Andes. So please help me welcome Dr. Kathleen Farley.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's been great to be in Portland, and every time I'm in the Pacific Northwest, it's sunny. So my husband, who is from here, keeps telling me that it's deluding me, but it's been a nice day. So as the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about payment for ecosystem services in the Ecuadorian Andes and looking at it as a tool for conservation and development, among other things. So I was asked to talk a bit about sort of the challenges and solutions related to payment for ecosystem services. So I'll try and go through a few of those kinds of promises and challenges that exist with these programs. I'd first like to acknowledge the students and collaborators who have been a really fundamental part of this project and ongoing work. Foremost among them is Leah Bremer, who's a PhD student who's been working with me on this project and has done a tremendous amount of field work and is working on writing up her dissertation now. Carol Harden is my collaborator at University of Tennessee, and Will Anderson was a master's student in the Department of Geography and also was a great help in conducting interviews and doing field work. So I know this series has had, I think, some more introductory talks on ecosystem services, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on that and definitions, but I thought I'd put up a couple. There are many definitions out there of ecosystem services. I sort of like this one, flows of value to human societies as a result of state and quantity of natural capital. I like it in particular because it includes that state and quantity of natural capital, and I think that's one of the challenges with implementing payment for ecosystem services and understanding flows of ecosystem services is understanding how potential changes in that state and quantity of natural capital, what kinds of ecosystem services they give us, what quantity of ecosystem services they give us, and then ultimately how that influences human well-being. In terms of payment of ecosystem services, the definition we used for this research was a very broad one intentionally. As this paper pointed out, many of the PES programs out there don't really link to an actual market and are kind of more broadly seen within a definition like this one that really focuses on a transfer of resources between social actors, which create incentives to align individual or collective land use decisions with social interests in the management of resources. So a very broad definition, one that really focuses on that transfer of some sort of resources that provides incentives for land use decisions. Again, probably a more simplified version of that is to think of PES as some kind of economic arrangement to pay for the conservation of ecosystem services. And particularly in the places where I work, these are often payments or other sorts of compensation to rural landowners, and they may or may not rely on a formal market, and most of the time they do not rely on a formal market. And I tend to go in between two different terms, compensation or payment for ecosystem services. In Ecuador, compensation is certainly the preferred term, and that tends to be more of a political decision. Most people there's some resistance to the idea of payment for ecosystem services there, and often compensation for ecosystem services is seen as a preferable way of phrasing it. I've used PES here mainly just because it's the more widely used term, but I often use compensation when I'm talking about the Ecuadorian context. And the economists in the room could give a better explanation of which one I probably should be using. So again, the idea of PES is that it allows us to somehow create incentives that change that stock or that state and quantity of natural capital that determines what kind of ecosystem services are produced and in what quantity they're produced, ultimately influencing human well-being. And that last part is really key for a lot of the programs that I've looked at, in particular because they're in developing countries where the idea is to try and somehow figure out ways that we can combine conservation and poverty alleviation or development in ways that do improve well-being for people living in these systems. So today I want to focus on three kind of main areas of both potential and challenge for PES. And I'll go through each of these in turn, but those three are combining conservation and poverty reduction into a single program. How can we get those two things together? Finding ways to expand conservation landscapes. And the sort of very simple one, the basic one, is actually providing and sustaining those ecosystem services that are promised through these programs. So in terms of the first one, there's a very long history of trying to combine conservation and development in different kinds of programs. Integrated conservation and development programs are a well-known one. Others in developing countries in particular have tried to join those two things together in the past. And a very good review of those efforts by Agrawal and Redford in 2006 found that there was really a lack of evidence to show that really worked, to show that those goals can be jointly achieved. And one of the things they pointed to was that having really appropriate definitions and measures of those two were one of the main impediments to showing that there's been any progress in that. That if we don't really define both what we mean by conservation, what conservation looks like and how we measure it, and if we don't define what poverty alleviation looks like and how we measure it, then it's very difficult to demonstrate that we're making gains in these programs. And others have pointed out, and that review was not about PES in particular, but just about trying to join conservation and poverty alleviation more generally. But with respect to PES programs, some people have pointed out ways that those goals of joining conservation and poverty alleviation might be impeded. And one of those is where those programs favor large landowners, and that there's some evidence for that happening in various parts of the world. And to the degree that they really focus on those large landowners, there are fewer benefits going to the poor who are meant to be benefiting from them. In places where they're landowner biased, so where those that are dependent on community land in particular or public land are excluded, and this can be a very important one in a lot of developing country contexts where community land makes up an important part of people's livelihoods, and in some cases public land as well. And also where the compensation that is given through PES ends up being less than what people would have made from the land otherwise. So they're actually worse off through the PES scheme than they would have been otherwise. So these are all sort of raised as sort of flags and challenges to look at in these programs, and how, if they intend to achieve conservation and poverty alleviation jointly, to what degree are these things being avoided? So the second potential is this idea of expanding conservation landscapes. And part of the promise of PES is promoting working landscapes as an alternative to protected areas. And part of that means kind of redefining what a working landscape is, that we tend to think of working landscapes as ones that produce goods, things like timber or an agricultural product. And the idea is that we can think about these working landscapes more broadly as producing services such as hydrologic regulation, as well as those goods that they have traditionally produced. And some people have suggested, and some of the promise of PES is that this kind of approach can be more inclusive, as an alternative to protected areas, which have often been criticized for excluding people and excluding their livelihoods. And where protected areas have come in and essentially pushed people out, you may get your conservation objectives met, but they come at the expense of people and livelihoods. So the idea behind PES is that you can expand conservation landscapes in a way that doesn't further cause exclusion of people that depend on those landscapes. And some of the literature that has looked at, to what degree is that being achieved, asks several questions. So one of them is PES activity enhancing or activity reducing? So when those PES programs come in, are people suddenly no longer able to participate in the activities that they used to, or are there new ways that activities are enhanced? Are there new employment options, or are there new sources of income? And another question that's raised is, how do land uses promoted by PES compare to the activities that they replace? So are they more or less labor intensive than the activities that they replace? What kinds of income are generated from those activities? And that when we think about PES relative to protected areas or other kinds of approaches to conservation, some of these questions need to be answered in order to understand the degree to which they might be achieving this goal of expanding conservation landscapes without impeding the ability of people to make a living off of the land. So the third is this idea simply of providing and sustaining ecosystem services. A lot of the idea behind PES is that we have recognized that these ecosystem services play an important role for society, that we depend on them for water and a variety of other things, and that we need to find ways or we hope to find ways to sustain those services. So PES is seen as a way to induce improving the state and quantity of natural capital that leads to the protection of those ecosystem services. The main issue with that is that we don't always know what state and quantity of natural capital gives us the ecosystem services we want. So we in many cases, this has sort of been taken as a given, but in fact, for many landscapes and many ecosystem types, we don't always know what state of that ecosystem best provides us the services we hope for, and we don't know what state of that ecosystem provides us multiple services in particular. So can we promote a particular state and quantity of natural capital that will give us 3, 4, 5 different services all at once, or will we get trade-offs among services? So these ecological production functions are something that are needed in lots of cases that tell us how much of a service we'll get from a given land use. And in particular, how much of multiple services we will get or lose under a given land use. And often this is information that is scarce or lacking for lots of PES programs. Much like the poverty alleviation, monitoring and measuring of impacts is crucial. So unless we are monitoring what happens to ecosystem services, it becomes difficult to demonstrate that these programs are actually providing and sustaining the services that they've promised. And it gets even more complex looking at multiple services and trying to think about both minimizing trade-offs and maximizing synergies across multiple among ecosystem services or across multiple ecosystem services. So when we just focus on carbon, we may make a particular choice about how to manage that system, but if we're hoping for carbon, water, and biodiversity, then we need to figure out to what degree those are synergistic or to what degree there may be trade-offs among them. And I think there are a couple of quotes that I include here that I think are useful for thinking about this third kind of potential and challenge of PES. And this one is that although it is admittedly only a small part of the challenge, quote, getting the science right is essential. We can't afford to promote forest protection for the sake of flood control in those cases where the local hydrology indicates that, in fact, forests will not help reduce the incidence of big floods. And again, I think this one is the one that sort of seems the most obvious, that of course we can't, but we don't have the science for lots of the programs that are moving forward, and that's reflected in this quote that projects are racing ahead of the science. We don't quite have the tools to help governments do what I think they want to do. And so this has been a big challenge in lots of places where PES is being implemented, is getting that science right and knowing what is that manipulation of the state and quantity of natural capital that we're really aiming for to get the services that are being promised. So in the case that I'm talking about, we're looking at these promises and challenges in the context of páramo grasslands, which, for those of you who are not familiar, they're grasslands that range primarily through the Andes in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and northern Peru, with a very small extension in Costa Rica. So they're from about 11 degrees north to 8 degrees south latitude, and they're about 3,200 to 4,700 meters altitude. So high altitude grasslands above tree line in the tropics. And the reason I'm looking at these systems, and in particular in Ecuador, but across the range of páramo grasslands, there's lots of interest in these questions, is because ecosystem services in páramo grasslands have been recognized to be very valuable. So one of the first, those carbon, water, and biodiversity are kind of the three that people tend to most look at. In the case of carbon, most of it's below ground. This is a soil profile from northern Ecuador. There's no scale on here, but this is about a meter deep of very carbon-rich soil. And this is from a study in Ecuador, but just gives you a basic idea of the above-ground carbon and below-ground carbon. When you add those together, páramo grasslands, because of their very high soil carbon stores, are actually comparable to rainforests in terms of their total carbon content. So there's been recognition that they're an important carbon sink, mainly because of that below-ground carbon. Water has been an even bigger issue with páramos. Many of the big cities in the northern Andes get all or most of their water from páramo grasslands. So cities like Quito and Bogotá are almost entirely reliant on páramo grasslands for their sources of water. So from big cities to agricultural production to other places, they've been recognized as extremely important for their hydrologic function. Biodiversity is also an important aspect of páramo grasslands. They have, within the Ecuadorian páramo grasslands, there are about 2,000 species of vascular plants. Across the range of páramos, there's estimated to be about 5,000 species, so tremendous plant diversity. More than 50% of them are thought to be endemic, so existing only in this region. So carbon, water, and biodiversity are all seen as very important and important reasons why PES is developing in these systems. And land uses there are typically grazing of sheep or cattle. These are sheep below Antisana volcano. And that's typically coupled with burning of vegetation every 1 to 3 years or so. So you have kind of these traditional land uses going on at the same time that you have an increasing recognition of the value of these ecosystems for providing these ecosystem services. In the case of Ecuadorian páramo grasslands, they again are in yellow on this map, and the extension is about 1.5 million hectares in the country. About a third of that is included within the system of protected areas known as the SNAP. And the other 2/3 is outside of that, obviously. And they're also characterized by having very high levels of poverty among the populations that inhabit páramo grasslands. And these characteristics have sort of made them, have also been part of the reason that they're the site of growing PES programs. There is quite a bit of an area that isn't protected in any other way. They have very high ecosystem services production values, and they have very high levels of poverty, making this idea of trying to join conservation and development that much more appealing. So we, in this project, it's been a multi-year project with multiple people, and I'm going to spend a fair bit of the time on the initial stage, which is really looking at these emerging PES programs in Ecuadorian páramo grasslands and trying to evaluate to what degree they sort of meet some of these promises of PES and to what degree those challenges still really exist in their implementation. So for this piece, we looked at 3 different questions. The first was, in what way do the programs address possibilities for jointly achieving conservation and poverty alleviation? And in that, we looked at what sorts of goals do they pursue and how are they incorporated into the program design. We asked what kinds of conservation landscapes do they produce? So are the programs providing some kind of an alternative to protected areas, or are they functioning as sort of an additional type of protected area? And how do they go about producing the ecosystem services that they're aiming to get? And in particular, we looked at how well do they account for relationships between land use and ecosystem service production, and how are they measured and monitored? And our methods included semi-structured interviews with key informants, including people at the Ministry of Environment, NGOs, and community leaders. We did document analysis and archival research, so looking at program and project documents, contracts and agreements, prioritization plans and management plans. We put together a database of I used CES there, of compensation for ecosystem service programs and projects in Ecuadorian Páramo grasslands, so just focusing on this ecosystem type in Ecuador. And today I'll talk about 2 case studies from within that database. There were 9 programs that we identified altogether, and I'll talk about 2 of those examples today. And then we did sampling of soils and above ground biomass. We did that in 2 different sites. I'll just be talking about one of those again, which is Comuna Zuleta, which is one of the ones I'll talk about in terms of their program design. For this last piece of sampling soils and biomass, we chose 8 sites with different land uses in the Páramo in Zuleta. And those ranged from, we had a couple of recently burned sites, one with and one without alpaca grazing. We had an intermediate burn exclusion, which we defined as 9 to 12 years of no burning on that land. As I mentioned, the typical pattern is to burn every 1 to 3 years, and there were some sites here that hadn't been burned for 9 to 12 years. And we looked at those with and without a plantation species called polylepis. So this is a species that is native to the Peruvian Andes. The genus is native to Ecuador, but this particular species is not. It's native to Peru. We looked at 2 sites with a longer-term burn exclusion, which we defined as 15 years without burning, with and without polylepis. And we looked at sites that were afforested with pine. So those were 40-year-old pines. They'd been there for, obviously, a very long time. And we looked at a former agricultural site with 5-year-old polylepis and alpaca grazing. And the idea behind this set of land uses that we chose was to say, okay, we've identified these programs that have these PES programs in Ecuadorian Páramos, and we've identified the kinds of land uses that they are promoting, and we wanted to see what kind of ecosystem service, how, in this case, and I'll just be talking about carbon today, but how carbon sequestration is influenced by these different kinds of land uses that are being incentivized. So in doing this, it was a space for time substitution. So we did our best to make sure that all sites were as similar as possible, except for that land use difference. So all sites were previously burned frequently and grazed with cattle, and they were all on similar slopes and elevation. To look at soil carbon and above ground carbon in those sites, we set up 3 20-meter transects and took soil samples every 2 meters from 0 to 10 centimeter depth and 10 to 20 centimeter depth. And for above ground carbon, we set up plots around each transect with subplots within them, and we calculated the biomass of trees, shrubs, and litter and herbaceous biomass in those nested plots. To come up with a value for above ground carbon for each of those sites. So I'll kind of go back to thinking about these first 2 case studies where I'm looking at Socio Páramo is the first one, and at Comuna Zuleta, which is the other one, and sort of look at how we evaluated them in terms of these 3 promises and challenges of PES. So a little bit of background on Socio Páramo. It is part of the larger program called Socio Bosque, which is really set up as a combined social program and a program for protection of ecosystem services. So the poverty focus was very strong from the outset. It was considered a very important part of the program when it was developed. And it's referred to as a conservation incentive. There's resistance to the term payment for ecosystem services, so it's been avoided within the program, and they instead refer to it as a conservation incentive. But it certainly fits within the definition of PES that we're using. Socio Páramo was considered a chapter of this program, and it was started in 2009. As of October 2010, there were 18 communities that had enrolled their land in it, and 63 individuals with enrolled land. And this is the signing of the first contracts in June 2009, the first communities that enrolled their land in Socio Páramo. So when we look at that first idea of kind of the promise and challenge of PES, the idea of conservation and poverty alleviation being combined, the conservation goals of Socio Páramo are to protect 800,000 hectares of páramo grasslands and to produce these three services, carbon, water, and biodiversity, all together. So they don't really differentiate in terms of prioritizing one of those over the other. They're all given equal weight and considered equally important. Poverty reduction, in terms of sort of how they've gone about doing that, they have definitely set out to attract small landowners, and the main way they did that was by creating an incentive structure that was intended to do that. So for the smallest areas enrolled, 1 to 50 hectares, they pay a higher value than as they get up to these larger land areas. So the idea behind this is to try and incentivize smallholders to participate and to avoid favoring those large landowners who might be set up to make the most money out of it if they were given the same amount per hectare as those small landowners. The second thing they did to try and meet those poverty reduction goals was to include community land. So from the get-go, community land has been a very important part of the program. And initially, they excluded public land, but made a change to the program in March 2010 and decided that they would make some exceptions to that. And the reason for that is that in Ecuador, there are protected areas that have people living in them. And in many cases, those people were living there prior to the establishment of the protected area. So they ended up having certain restrictions on their land already by the fact that they live in a protected area, and then on top of it, they were being excluded from this program. So as they got some complaints about that, they decided to modify the program and allow some public land to be included, even though in a sense it's sort of being double protected in that way. And the third thing that they did is to prioritize areas with the highest NBI, which was an index of unsatisfied basic needs. So the idea behind it was to say, okay, if poverty is one of our most important goals, we need to find the places that have the highest levels of poverty and prioritize them for participation in the program. However, what they found when they did their prioritization scheme is that they just did it's high levels or low levels. So it was sort of a yes or no type question. And as this map shows, almost the whole country comes out as having very high levels of poverty. So at the parochial level, which is the census level they used for this analysis, they essentially found that the whole country was poor, and it didn't help them to differentiate more and less poor places. So for that reason, they didn't end up giving that poverty, although they initially intended to make poverty the most highly weighted part of the prioritization scheme. In the end, they didn't do that and the main reason they told us was that because they found that it didn't differentiate them. If they gave it more weight, it would just give more weight to every place, just about every place in the country. So they ended up with their poverty piece having about the same weight as each of the ecosystem services individually, and about a third of the level of threat when they came up with their final prioritization scheme. So to some degree, they were able to include poverty, but really in terms of prioritization, it did not work as well. Most of it came in the form of the incentive structure that they put together. So in terms of the conservation landscapes produced, initially, as I mentioned, they excluded any land that was within the system of protected areas. They've since modified that somewhat. But they do include land with intensive or semi-intensive grazing or monocultures. So they are trying to create conservation landscapes in land that isn't considered to be highly degraded already. So trying to find land that might be considered to be in good enough condition to be part of the system of protected areas, but that is not yet included in it. Within the areas that are enrolled, the restrictions that they have stated are that there's no burning allowed. So as I mentioned, that burning has been part of the grazing regime in these grasslands. So burning is not allowed in any of them, and limited grazing is allowed. So this could be characterized as activity reducing, since they're not able to continue with some of the traditional activities. Lowered labor intensity, since the burning is no longer allowed and the grazing is supposed to be reduced. And the kind of compensation they get from it is really just the compensation directly from Socio Páramo. So it's that direct payment from the government to them, as opposed to creating a new sort of income source beyond that. So it can largely be seen as sort of a land set aside and really a complement to the system of protected areas, as opposed to a real alternative to it. However, that is also, in theory and in practice, what has been seen so far is that it's much more on a case-by-case basis. That the no burning and limited grazing has not the no burning is being imposed, but the limited grazing really hasn't been so far. People haven't been asked to take cattle off of their land yet, and that in practice they are actually allowing many of these working landscapes to continue. So while on paper it really functions as a new type of protected areas, in practice that's not so much the case, at least so far. In terms of ecosystem services production and that connection between land use and ecosystem services production, fire and grazing are really part of an ongoing debate in Páramo grasslands. It's difficult to know what the historical role of fire is in these ecosystems, and it's difficult to know what happens when fire is excluded. There are a number of studies that look at the effects of intensive burning and grazing on these systems and show degradation with those activities, but there's no research that shows what happens when those activities are taken off of the land. So at this point, it's really this piece that really links particular land uses with the production of ecosystem services is really based much more on assumptions and sort of best knowledge than on actual data. And in particular, the production of multiple ecosystem services from a single land use is one that doesn't have a lot to back it up just yet. As I mentioned, they hope to get biodiversity, carbon, and water all out of kind of a single land use prescription. And it's not really clear that there is a single land use that maximizes all three of those ecosystem services at once. And there hasn't really been any study yet if there might be any trade-offs among ecosystem services and if those might be different in one type of páramo versus another. So that gets back to that idea of the state and the quantity of natural capital. The idea is to use PES to improve that, but we don't really know what improvement means in this case. The second case is Comuna Zuleta, and a little background on this community. It's about 1,000 residents, most of whom are indigenous. About 2/3 of the land is páramo or Andean forest, and the previous land use on most of that, they had agriculture that was expanding up into the páramo, which is a very common pattern in páramo grasslands in Ecuador and other countries. And it was mostly dominated by cattle grazing with yearly burning on the community land. But those cattle were owned by very few families, so they benefited few families, even though it was communal land. And as a result, the community decided to create a conservation area in 1995. So within that conservation area, they started to try and remove that cattle and remove the burning. And they, after establishing it, began two different PES programs, one water-focused and one carbon-focused. So in terms of the conservation and poverty alleviation goals, the conservation goals were sort of broadly to protect the páramo from activities that were seen as degrading. So they wanted to protect that water source and they kind of hope to see to get benefits in biodiversity as a co-benefit of these activities. So their conservation goals really focused a lot on removal of burning. This is a bench from the town that says the páramo is the source of life, don't burn. So really trying to kind of change people's mentality about burning and their ideas about the effects of that activity on the ecosystem. And in terms of development, they wanted to replace activities in the páramo that benefited very few families with ones that benefited the entire community. So poverty alleviation per se really wasn't a goal of their program, but a type of development that would benefit a greater number of people was. And they were the effort to shift to something that benefited the entire community was very much intentional. In terms of the kinds of conservation landscapes produced, the name of the conservation area they established is the Bosque y Vegetación Protectora Zuleta, and within that they eliminated burning and cattle grazing. They, in some areas of that, replaced it with alpaca production, which is thought to be less damaging to the grasslands than cattle grazing. Within it, they produce the service of water, which goes to the nearby city of Ibarra, which has several 100,000 people, and they receive compensation from the city in the form of what they call a guarda-páramo. So that's somebody who is a type of park guard for this area who keeps out anybody who would come in and bring in burning or cattle. So all in all, it's largely an activity-reducing type of PES or CES. It's removing activities that were seen as degrading, adding some, but at a much lower intensity than previously existed. So some of that is activity shifting, but largely can be seen as activity reducing. They also, and so this is the piece that's the water piece. The piece that's focused on carbon consists of these Polylepis racemosa plantations. This is Polylepis racemosa planted here. As I mentioned, it's a species that's native to Peru, although the genus is native to Ecuador, and it's widely referred to as a native species by many of the people planting it, though many of the biologists in the country are quick to point out that it's not native. And so with this, there's some activity enhancement. At the time those plantations are established, they receive money that covers about 80% of the cost of the plantations, of the seedlings or saplings and the labor associated with planting them. So there's activity enhancement at that time. In the case of Zuleta, they actually established a nursery, and they're producing saplings of this species, which they're selling and distributing to other communities in the region. So they have added activity enhancement that was sort of a follow-on of this program. And they'll have new forms of income from timber in about 15 to 20 years to the degree that they get timber production from this. These are not really timber species, so most of the PES programs that have focused on using plantations for carbon sequestration have used pine and other species that are more timber species, but to the degree that there is any income, even if it's from some pruning of these species, those will come at a later date. And then finally, Comuna Zuleta, as we were doing this research, ended up enrolling in Socio Páramo, so they've enrolled this land there as well. And at this stage, they haven't been asked to do anything different. So they are receiving payments for it, but it could be considered activity neutral because it really hasn't had an impact on the way that they're managing this land. In terms of production of ecosystem services, within Zuleta, the idea, the expectation is that by eliminating burning and grazing, they expect to see recovery of the grasslands in about 15 years. There are no data for this, so this is really based on what they consider to be the best available information. So in terms of, there's really no kind of monitoring or baseline information on what happens with burning and grazing. In terms of the Polylepis racemosa plantations, really the assumed effect is positive. They assume that because it is a native species, which is sort of debatable, but to the degree that it's more native than things like pine, it is assumed to have a positive effect. So there's been lots of promotion of planting this species in Ecuador with the idea that it's moving away from a past of planting conifers that are native to temperate zones and producing something that's closer to native to this ecosystem. So the assumption is that it will have a positive effect, but again, there are really no data on that. There's monitoring of the above ground carbon because these are planted for carbon sequestration, but there's no data on the broader effect of these plantations. So one of our goals, I guess I can use that. One of our goals was to try and build on that and say, well, we'll take a couple of sites and we'll look at what exactly happens in the case of carbon or water or biodiversity in these sites. And I'm just going to present the carbon data. That's what we have so far. Leah Bremer, the student I mentioned at the beginning, is working on biodiversity data, and my colleague Carol Harden has water data from these sites. So what we've found so far is that looking at this set of land use sites that I mentioned in the methods section, this is showing soil carbon across those sites. And what we found is that lowest soil carbon was in these pine and the former agricultural sites. So we had significantly lower soil carbon in the pine, and this is showing the 0 to 10 and the 10 to 20 centimeter. And fairly similar levels in this site that was a former agricultural site. It was used for potato cultivation prior to being converted into part of this conservation land. The sites with the highest soil carbon were the ones with the longest burn exclusion, so those ones that hadn't been burned for 15 years. And that looked really interesting until we found that one of the sites with a recent burn also had high soil carbon. So we don't have very conclusive results in terms of what happens to soil carbon under these different land uses, other than that we know that pine really, planting pine is very similar to having any kind of it's analogous to having a crop on the land in terms of the effects on soil carbon. In terms of planting polylepis, we didn't find any effective planting. In past research that I did in Ecuador on pine plantations, we could see an effect on soil carbon, a decline in soil carbon similar to what we saw here within 5 to 10 years following plantation. So these are still young plantations, but are not showing those kinds of effects, at least within the time since plantation, which is about 10 years now. Or actually, no, it's about 7 years at this point. So what we can see is if we compare sites with a similar time of burn exclusion, such as 2 and 3 here, or 6 and 7 here, one with polylepis and one without, we really don't see, there are no significant differences between those, so we can't detect an effect of planting polylepis. In terms of above ground carbon, some of the results were not surprising at all. We found the lowest above ground carbon where there was a recent burn. Not surprising, most of it had been burned off, so those are these two sites here. We found the highest above ground carbon in the pine site. Again, not surprising. These are 40-year-old pines, so there's lots of biomass that's accumulated over 4 decades. And what we found was that it was really variable among intermediate and longer burn exclusion, as well as with and without polylepis. And this was the more surprising part, that when we looked at these 4 sites here, which are the intermediate burn exclusion and the longer burn exclusion, there's really not much difference across those 4 sites. So it doesn't make a huge amount of difference if a site has burn exclusion for 9 to 12 years or 15 years in terms of the amount of above ground carbon. That in and of itself is not too surprising. What's more surprising is it doesn't make a huge amount of difference if polylepis is planted or not. So the point of planting these trees is for above ground carbon sequestration. And what we found is that when we looked at total carbon, these sites in particular where there had been burn exclusion have so much herbaceous biomass that they are equal to, or in some cases greater. This site has polylepis planted, this does not. So in this case, a site without polylepis planted actually has higher total above ground carbon than the site with polylepis planted that has similar burn exclusion. So that was the more surprising part of these results. So kind of to wrap up, kind of going back to those three themes of the promises and challenges of PES and kind of looking at the couple of cases I presented, in terms of the first promise, the potential for conservation and poverty alleviation, with Socio Páramo, what we found was that the program design did a good job in terms of attention to the type of landowners it was including, in terms of the compensation levels, at least from what we know so far. As Leah Bremer, the student that I mentioned, will be looking in more detail at what those compensation levels mean for individual participants and their livelihoods. And in terms of the investment plans and asking the communities to create an investment plan that where they decide across the community how that money is going to be used. In terms of really including the poorest areas, they would need to substantially scale down their prioritization scheme, which may or may not be feasible. And in practice, what we've heard from the extension workers is that they will go out to land and look at, if somebody wants to participate, they'll go out and look at their land and consider it regardless of whether they fall in the highest priority areas in that prioritization scheme. And probably the really key piece is that the measurement of outcomes is probably the biggest challenge, and that in order to demonstrate that this program is having an effect on poverty, they need to have some way of measuring that and demonstrating that outcome. And so far that really isn't part of the program, other than the existence of these investment plans, which can be tracked over time in terms of how that money is used. In the case of Zuleta, as I mentioned, poverty alleviation really wasn't an explicit goal, but they link conservation with broader social development goals and focus on activities that benefit the entire community. So in the case of this much more local scale PES program compared to the national scale Socio Páramo, there really does seem to be quite a bit of promise for it to contribute to those social development goals and contribute to conservation and combination of conservation and development. In terms of the alternative to protected areas or the types of conservation landscapes being produced, Socio Páramo really is more focused on expanding the net area of protected land by including private land. So in that sense, it's really more activity reducing, though in practice, lowered intensity working landscapes are being included, and so there's some activity neutral and even some that are activity enhancing, where some of the communities have decided to invest money in things that provide some kind of temporary employment, like some of them have chosen to invest in a park guard or other things that at least one or some individuals have a new kind of employment because of the program. In the case of Zuleta, it really is a matrix of protected and working landscapes. They have some areas that are being entirely protected from burning, grazing, or any other activities. Some areas where new types of working landscapes are being produced with the alpaca and with the polylepis. So they really have created a matrix of protected and working landscapes, and I think probably respond more to that promise of PES of creating new ways of creating conservation landscapes. And they also have some new income sources, in particular through the nursery for polylepis saplings. In terms of production and maintenance of ecosystem services, both programs are really based on assumed ecological relationships, so that those ecological production functions that we hope to have in developing PES really don't exist for either of these. In the case of Socio Páramo, in terms of measuring and monitoring, they are responsible for monitoring, but they're incredibly understaffed, so most of it's likely to be done through remote sensing, which for the places where the program is focused on forests might be more effective, and is probably going to be quite difficult for these grassland areas where remote sensing is a more difficult way to really get at what's happening on the ground. In the case of Zuleta, there's really limited or no monitoring of the outcomes of these changes in land use, in particular with respect to hydrologic services, which are what they have most prioritized. And so, based on the data we have so far, and what I just showed you in terms of what we found with a below ground and above ground carbon in Zuleta, it looks like burning exclusion might be effective for restoration, but really the results are still mixed. As I mentioned, the two sites that did have burning exclusion had higher soil carbon, but one of the more recently burned sites did as well. And the effects of polylepis afforestation are really still unclear. So much like pine in the past, plantations are moving forward at a very rapid pace, but really based on an assumption about what the ecological outcome will be rather than on any empirical evidence of what that will be. So evidence from other sites is very much needed, and there's a need to understand the effects on water and biodiversity as well in order to get at those potential trade-offs or synergies. So even if burning exclusion is effective for restoration in terms of carbon, we don't really know if that's also the best land use prescription in terms of water or biodiversity, and there are questions about whether it would be. So questions remain also about the value of burning and grazing exclusion relative to the potential livelihood impacts. As I mentioned, we didn't see much difference in terms of intermediate burn exclusion and longer-term burn exclusion. So it raises the idea that it may not be necessary to exclude burning entirely, but perhaps to burn on a less frequent rotation, and you may be able to get those same ecosystem services produced without having as much of an impact on livelihood production. And lastly, I think one of the things that came out of the ecological piece of our work in Zuleta is really the value of focusing on both below ground and above ground carbon, which is typically not done when we look at carbon as an ecosystem service. Most of the focus is above ground. And these are just more data to show that in places like Páramo grasslands, the below ground carbon should be included. And this is the piece of the prioritization from Socio Bosque looking at carbon, which only included above ground carbon, even though Páramos are known for below ground carbon, and for that reason really just prioritized the lowland rainforest as the most important area, and most of the Páramo was very low on this prioritization because it was really only looking at above ground. But so we'd argue that below ground C should be included when they decide what the priority areas are. But in addition, what we found was that above ground carbon really can be quite important in these grasslands, even relative to some tree species like Polylepis racemosa, where you can have this very large herbaceous component, particularly when you have less frequent burning, and that within Ecuador and beyond, thinking about the role of grassland conservation in climate mitigation strategies may be a valuable approach, along with approaches that focus on reduced deforestation and focus on other types of systems. So with that, I'd like to just acknowledge and thank the people from Socio Páramo and the ministry who were very generous with their time, and from Comuna Zuleta, as well as some of the organizations in Ecuador that gave their time and support to us. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
I have a question. From curiosity, are the alpaca domesticated, or is this part of something so
That's
my other question is about the carbon accumulation rates of the grassland, because it sounds like that the ecosystem accumulates, but I didn't really get that.
I'm sorry, I
didn't really get whether the carbon accumulation of the grassland was, it's actively sequestering, or is it just an ancient system with lots of carbon in this?
Okay. So the first part, alpaca they're domesticated, and there actually isn't much of a culture of raising alpaca in Ecuador. One of the site we worked at in southern Ecuador is owned by somebody who started alpaca raising there about 30 years ago and had to essentially smuggle them in from Peru. So it's not something that indigenous communities or others really have a history of, and so they've been brought in from other places, and some groups are promoting it, so it's becoming more common. In terms of the carbon accumulation, the soils are definitely actively accumulating carbon. These are mostly, well, they're all volcanic ash soils, so they have very rapid rates of carbon accumulation. And they, some of them have been, I should have the numbers here, but I don't, but they are actively accumulating carbon. And so they're kind of seen, and that's part of the debate of this. If we were to consider below ground carbon, these are really important carbon sinks that are actively accumulating carbon and will be doing so for hundreds to thousands of years. And so in that sense, they're a much more stable sink than above ground, which tends to be more vulnerable to loss through fire and other things.
Hi, I was curious about how you would limit the amount of grazing with the alpacas and sheep in the area. Would you, like with the protected area, would you just remove the alpaca from those protected areas? And if so, then the alpaca and sheep would be grazing in another area. So
that's a great question. Yeah, and so alpaca aren't being removed. It's really cattle and sheep that they're in theory removing, and in theory they're allowed to have alpaca, but they're really trying to still gather data that would allow them to say, okay, this is going to be the carrying capacity if you have cattle, this is going to be the carrying capacity if you have sheep, and this is going to be the carrying capacity if you have alpaca, but they don't have that yet. And that's a great question, and it's a really important piece of PES. Are you just going to move that activity somewhere else, or are you going to in which case you have leakage, or are you going to prevent that activity from happening? And Leah Bremer, the graduate student, is really looking at that much more closely because she's actually interviewing all these people and saying, what did you actually do? And what she found is that so few people have been really told that they had to take their cattle off so far that there's not much evidence that anything's happening. And they may be told that they need to take it off later, but so far they haven't. And the idea is that they will intensify land use in areas that are below the páramo, that are already agricultural and already converted, in order to leave that páramo grassland alone. And I think that's both the intent, and I think what's been seen in some of the other programs where people they just start moving things down to places that are already converted. But there's certainly the possibility that they could move it to a different patch that in which case you don't really gain much.
One of my questions was kind of addressed by what you just said, but how does restrictions on burning affect regrowth and grazing potential, perhaps of alpaca, if they're trying to discourage cattle and sheep, and would that affect the potential for local people to the revenues that they might otherwise get from that? And then the other part of my question is, how are local people informed about and how do they respond to these programs?
Both great questions. The first one, we don't really know. There's really no research that looks at, as I said, the research that does exist is what happens when you have lots of grazing and lots of burning. There's really nothing that says what happens when you pull that all off. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think, with that third promise and peril of PES is that we don't really know what happens with burning exclusion for ecosystem services production, and we don't really know very well what happens in terms of the ability to graze there. And it probably varies from place to place. Our site in Zuleta, those places where there's burning exclusion are still really herbaceous dominated, whereas the site in southern Ecuador, they're becoming very woody, and so that certainly has implications for the ability to graze any animal there. And we think that probably has to do with how they were used before burning was excluded. And places where you had a very uniform landscape and then burning was taken off everywhere, I think you end up with that more uniform type grassland. And places that had more diversity and had more proximity to Andean forest and had those seed sources, you end up getting much woodier species coming in. And so I think that's another piece of the complication when I think about that state and quantity of natural capital, it's not the same from one place to another. And so it's another complication of having a single prescription that not each place isn't necessarily going to respond the same way. And the other piece was how people respond to the program, and that's, again, I think a really interesting part of what Leo is working on. And I've just read a draft of hers, and I think part of it, what she's finding is that the communities that are most able to take advantage of these programs and participate are the ones that already have those existing connections to an NGO or to some group that helps them participate. Because even if they know about it, many of them are skeptical about it. They have concerns that their land could be expropriated if they participate, or other sorts of just distrust issues. And so the ones that have connections with NGOs have been able to get more information that would make them want to participate. And they've been able to get more support that allows them to participate. So putting together those community investment plans is very difficult for a community that may not have that kind of background, or may not have a connection with an NGO that helps them do it, or may just have more internal conflict in the community that makes it more difficult for them to agree on that. So one of her findings is sort of, it takes capital to make capital in a sense, and if you don't have some of that existing social capital, it can be difficult to participate.
You indicated that somebody is measuring the biodiversity.
The same student is, yeah.
Okay, and so what's she measuring?
She's looking at plant diversity. So she's looking at species richness and plant species richness and abundance.
By that, do you mean like the number of species?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And I think, as I mentioned, the Páramos, despite some of these photos looking like sort of homogeneous landscapes, have this incredible plant diversity. And so whether people consider that biodiversity to be an ecosystem service or not, it's certainly a piece that even if we focus just on carbon and water, the hope is to certainly not lose that biodiversity in the process. And there are some people who feel that excluding burning might have the possibility of reducing diversity. And so that's one thing she's looking at, but she's still analyzing data, so I don't know what she's got so far.
You mentioned the connections to the NGOs and that sort of outside groups. And there's this idea that the reason some countries like Ecuador and Costa Rica did so well in sustainability was that they were very receptive to both outside groups coming in and for their own scholars to go out. So this is, do you have a comment on that, and especially in context of sort of like traditional ecological knowledge? Sort of the innovation flow from international scholarship versus TEK?
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to generalize. I think one of the reasons I like comparing Socio Páramo as a national level program to Zuleta, which is this very local one, is that some of the criticism of PES is that it can be kind of imposed from the outside, and communities get sort of pushed to do things that are really ultimately about conservation and less about their livelihoods. And one of the things that makes Zuleta such an interesting case is that a lot of it really was locally derived. Locally, they chose to create this conservation area, and it was a local decision that was the best way to manage the land. And that's very different from Socio Páramo, which was definitely developed in conjunction with some big international conservation organizations, and I think drew on lessons from international experiences in other places, and was able to kind of use that as a knowledge base and resource base. So I think you have examples of both, very locally derived ones and ones that really draw on experiences elsewhere. Other question? Yeah.
Actually, I have one more question. What's the mechanism by which the carbon is being sequestered in the soil?
It is through photosynthesis by the grasslands, and in these grasslands, they have a tremendous amount of their biomass is below ground rather than above ground. So they have extensive root systems, and these are cold and wet places. So they have very slow rates of decomposition. Because they're volcanic soils, they have a chemical composition of organic mineral complexes that tend to inhibit decomposition as well. So they end up with these very high rates of soil carbon accumulation, basically through that root biomass becoming incorporated into the soil and decomposing very slowly. And so that's partly a function of being a volcanic soil. So globally, volcanic soils tend to have very high carbon contents. It's also a function of being in the tropics, so there's very high production of these grasslands year-round. There's no dormant season, and partly a function of being at high altitude, wet place that keeps decomposition from happening very quickly. Thank you.